Hello and welcome to Bit by Bit. I am Ben Beharan, joined by my colleague Carolina Milanesi. We thought it would be a good time to address the big antitrust case, or the looming antitrust case that everybody saw coming, but officially the United States Department of Justice is going after Apple for being a monopolist or behaving like a monopolist. Um, there's been a ton of commentary. We wish we could have commented on it sooner, but travel schedules did not allow. But I know we both have been vocal on Twitter. So let's start with sort of our main takes, on kind of the complaint, some of the commentary we've heard from both sides. So I'll let you start. What were some of your takeaways, and maybe start with some of the things that don't sit with you well regarding the way that the DOJ has positioned their case against Apple?
My main point, and I made that public as soon as the complaint came out, was around consumers and the fact that there's almost an implication every time that this comes up, either with Epic or the whole iMessage issue with Android, and now with the case that consumers are not happy where they are or don't have a choice. And more importantly, that they're not in a position to make an intelligent choice about what vendors, walled garden or not, they want to put their money and their time and devices in. And I think that when it comes to Apple, you have customers that might not be happy about one aspect or two, or we all talked about the green bubble and the blue bubble, and I've been vocal about that as well. Or the fact that because of family members, they're using technology that maybe they don't want to use, like FaceTime instead of Duo or something else. But the reality is that the people that are using these devices do so because they're more convenient. I was having an interesting exchange actually with an analyst friend of ours on X, where it was saying, "Well, I wish I didn't have to use FaceTime, but it's so convenient that then I use it." I said, "Well, but then you answer your own points. Like, it's so convenient, it's so easy that I use it." And I think that that's what gets lost, is like nobody is really forced to stay where they are. The other part that I find amusing is how, as the case is made, there's almost an implication of, well, you can't have a vertical approach to a service, a product, a go-to-market. And as a company, you're almost not entitled to decide who you want to work with and partner with, and the kind of things that you can accept or not accept into your world, into what you have created. And that's the part that I struggle a little bit with. I certainly don't think that the Apple is stopping innovation, because there's plenty of innovation that is happening in the Android side of things. And you can't have your cake and eat it too. You can't agree that they're stopping innovation and then at the same time, when the new iPhone comes out, say, oh, they're just catching up now to whatever is available on Android and has been available for, 2 years or whatever number of iterations. So there's this, very hodgepodge of reasons that have been put forward that I don't think are all necessarily valid. There are some there are, and I think we'll get to it. What about you? What are the things that rub you the wrong way?
Yeah, so I wanted to comment on your consumer one because I know we both completely agree with this, and I think what's hard for me is it's kind of a recognition of kind of two fundamental things regarding consumer behavior. There's exactly how you put it, which is that the case, and I understand why you'd have to make this case. I mean, if we were the Department of Justice saying we would frame it this way, as they are operating exactly as I thought. but you have to make it look like, because again, the hardest thing they're going to have to do is prove consumer harm. So they start with that angle, which is exactly what you said, which is that these people are like unwillingly trapped, because that's kind of like the way that it comes off, right? I am an I'm locked in unwillingly, and anybody with half a brain knows that that's not true, right? There is consumer choice. You can get a lot of different devices. Google has a chart or an image that you and I have both seen that says it's never been easier to switch to Android. Even Brian Chen had an interesting article today in the New York Times talking about his switching to Android. And he was like, it wasn't hard to switch, but there were those conveniences that he missed because there was such an integrated system. And so I think the consumers choosing a product because of its merit, meaning that they have vetted it and said, this is the best one for me, that's what I think people have a hard time recognizing, that that's going on with Apple. I think there's really this trap, and I do think the government kind of fed into this in terms of using China as a competitive market, or using the low end, saying that Apple's phones are expensive, by just believing that if it was cheaper, right, that price is the thing, that if a better priced competitor existed, it would do better. Like, that's just not true. Like, consumer ASP is what it is because they value those products.
And in that argument, they're also limiting Apple to the hardware, which we both know is
Right.
not the case, right?
Right. Exactly. So that to me is just a hard one, because it just defies actual true consumer behavior, which, we've spent so much time studying and we see, and it just breaks that kind of, overarching logic. And so just that idea that I'm unwillingly trapped. And the thing I was thinking about too is, again, it's not illegal to be a monopoly if you've acquired it by being the best in breed. Like, that, the government has said that, right? What they say is illegal is when you use that leverage to inhibit competitors. Okay, well, the reality is, like, the government has allowed a very different system. So, like, cable companies, for example, it is extremely difficult to change from one cable company to another. And in some cases, you don't even have an option, because that company has been allowed to lay the lines down. And so they are your only option. So I would argue that, like, cable MSOs is a far worse monopoly, because those customers are unwillingly trapped with a product that we know does not have good
Might be
customer
subpar.
satisfaction. Yeah.
Yeah.
The difference is, if Apple's customers were unwillingly trapped, why would iPhone customer satisfaction continually be in the high 90s? It wouldn't. It just wouldn't. Like, that defies the entire logic of the argument. So that part bothers me, right? So just this consumer bucket. I totally agree with you in terms of, it's an attack on differentiation, which is the attack on a vertical model, because the vertical model says, I've invested in these things so that I can stand out from my competitors. That's why Apple doesn't let iOS go to other companies. That's why they don't sell their chips to other companies. That's why they don't, do the things that they do and license their IP to others, because that's their differentiation. And so the threat of this case is also on the basis of differentiation, right? And then the last one has bothered me for a really long time, which is the government's continued attempt to move from a general understanding of market share to really
Mm.
isolating this to a narrowly market defined. And they tried this with Qualcomm. They've tried this with the Epic case. They've tried this multiple times to basically say, if you have 90% share of a 15% share of the market, then you're a monopoly. And that's just so bad, because if the government is allowed to do that, then literally everybody in tech, watch out, because everybody has a good chunk of their share and they defend that share. And if the government can come after your 15% or your 20%, then this is a real problem. Now, granted, I know in the United States they're roughly more like 50%, fine, but it's still not 80, 90%, where, again, that's been the traditional, you really, there is no choice, right? There is a lot of choice. There's a lot of diversity. People might argue with that, but that fundamental point of, I'm worried that they get away, because they've tried at least twice, as far as I've watched, to be able to justify and set precedent for a narrowly market defined definition of antitrust. I think that's a super dangerous precedent.
It's also kind of a weird time to talk about, anything that might define what is vertical and what isn't. Because if you're thinking about AI and the role that AI is going to play in how we interact with apps or a system, it can be two things. It's either going to disenfranchise the whole app ecosystem as we know it today, because I'm going to get my answers in other ways, right? And we have started to see vendors like Rabbit as an example, right? Where I'm going to ask, and granted, it's not a phone, it's a standalone device, but once I grant this device all my logins for
Right.
everything, is going to give me the
Right.
answer without me having to open any of the apps that will provide me with either an answer or a service.
Right.
So that's one thing. And the other one linked to, the verticalization is, would this then apply to also AI and LLM providers? And if you're thinking about Microsoft and what they're doing with Copilot and how pervasive they're going
Right.
to be, to your point about if they get away with this, everybody else needs to watch out, because I'm sure that we're already having plenty of scrutiny, and rightly so, on AI. But once you start to have Copilot embedded in DOS at a silicon level, and then at the application level in services, then what does that say about
Yep. Yep.
control?
Yep. And the irony of what you just outlined is basically a recognition that everybody would like to be more vertical like Apple. Just many people have failed at pulling that off. And we can run the risk, especially. And I think we had not talked about it on this, since Bit by Bit is new, but our public commentary kind of over and all had raised a similar question when voice assistants were all the thing. We were saying, like, well, are you going to be loyal to just one voice assistant, or is there going to be many? Because the reality is, everybody wants you to just use their voice assistant, and then their voice assistant becomes the primary interface to all your things, therefore monopolizing your time computing. And that's really, so now we're at this disjunction again, where we're saying about AI, which is everybody is actually moving in a more vertical direction. Like, the government is sort of saying, like, well, we want to attack this business model, without recognizing that everybody in the industry is trying to become and control more of those ecosystems. They've had a really hard time accomplishing that. I mean, I guarantee you Google would be the same way. Google would prefer to have a tightly integrated ecosystem across all of those devices and essentially be much more ecosystem oriented. They just, because of the fragmentation and all, it's just a very, very harder challenge when you don't control as much of the stack as Apple. So it's a deterrent from really where things are going. And I think that's kind of why people have complained and been worried about this case, is that it really is questioning how much differentiation is allowed. And I just think that shouldn't be up to the government. That should be up to the company and the market to determine, how much they're willing to be involved in any one ecosystem or another.
And I think is also obviously linked to the business model, right? That, yes, Google might want to be more tightly integrated, but at the same time, the way that their business model works is, the more pervasive they are, the more revenue they generate. So
Yeah.
if you're thinking
Yeah.
about their search and their advertising business, and for Apple is about the hardware, and so everything brings back the value to the hardware. And we've seen them open up some of their services to other platforms, where they've done so where that integration doesn't really matter. So if you're thinking about music and you're thinking about Apple TV, well, it doesn't really matter if I'm more, yes, maybe some level, if you're thinking about music and lossless sound or things like that, but it doesn't really matter where I watch an Apple TV, episode of Ted Lasso. Can be my TV, my Samsung TV can be my Mac or my phone. It doesn't really matter. And it's the same with music, right? But where it matters, where the fact that you are so deeply entrenched in the ecosystem gives you a better experience. That's
Yeah.
what they're trying to safekeep.
Yeah. Well, and to your point, I mean, I don't know how many people have tried this, but the vast majority of apps that I try, like your TV example, right? So Apple TV on a non-Apple TV handset or TV, music and stuff on Windows, even when iTunes was on Windows, it didn't work as well when it was on Mac. You know, and sometimes you're like, well, why is this? Like, it's just software, but some of those apps they just don't work as well. It's slow, it's unpredictable, it might crash. Like there's so many variables, which kind of again emphasizes the point about the value of being vertical is stuff is just going to work better, and that has to again tie back into a company's differentiation. So I think there's the part of like what you just said, right? The integration doesn't matter, those apps get there, but there's areas where I think if I'm just going to try to say the way I think Apple would think about this, where they would say that experience is non-negotiable, and so therefore it belongs on our hardware.
And I think as we were kind of getting ready to go on air, we were talking about how Apple sometime is might make statements about, for instance, privacy and advocate for privacy, but then doesn't necessarily put that privacy first in moving certain solutions or features to non-Apple environments. And I think that was one of the arguments that people were making around iMessage and why Apple would not make iMessage available on Android or on Windows PCs. And it goes back to your point that you just made, because they cannot be in control of that environment the same way as they are on their own hardware and their own ecosystem. So,
Right.
can Apple do some of it? Sure. Will they still want it to be iMessage versus something else that they make about? Probably not. And at the end of the day, we go back to the point that we started with, which is, as a vendor, I should be able, as a brand, to decide my
Right.
go-to-market and where I want to
Right.
be positioned.
Right. And I think the crux of that point, right, is that there's a tone within sort of the government's claim that that insinuates Apple should bring more of their technology or their IP to other platforms, right? And so I think when you think about that, right, it sounds at a high level, you're like, okay, that makes sense, right? Why shouldn't I be able to use an Apple Watch with my Android device, or a Garmin better, right, with my phone? But I think Apple's point is, it's not their responsibility to innovate on behalf of their competition. And if they want to keep these things isolated to their ecosystem for the reasons that we've just defended, like they should have that right. And it's not really about saying that a customer can't do X, Y, and Z. It's just that what Apple's essentially saying is, we make a bit of hardware, we integrate it with our system, or we makes, a whatever it is, part of the ecosystem. And that's how they're trying to differentiate. And so it's very different. And that again speaks to, that's what it means to be vertical, not horizontal. And that's still the ultimate probing they're trying to do at this some degree, a vertical business model.
Yeah, I think that the argument that people make on things like that, and I think that the watch is a good example, is how is Apple preventing other vendors to tap into their APIs, right? And
Yeah.
I think that
Right.
that's the argument that a lot of people make. And I agree with you in terms of those vendors should innovate on their own, true, but at the same time, they can only go that far, right? Because at the end of the day, Apple will decide how far they can go
Right.
based on the APIs that they make available. And so,
Right.
if you look at Samsung, they done a great job in trying to allow users to use a Samsung watch, Galaxy Watch, with
Right.
an iOS device.
Right.
They come a long way. It's never going to be the same as having an Apple Watch and an iPhone, but
Right.
they know that.
Right. Well, and I think again, just to that point, right? You can use a Garmin, and its app with your watch. You're just obviously you're not getting messages the same way. You have an Aura ring. I have a Whoop. They work perfectly fine, with Apple, just because again, it's got access to data. It's got access to my health data. It works with my Apple Watch in conjunction. So it's not like this is impossible, but I get right that what I would not expect, nor should I again think people the government should force Apple to open up their APIs to the degree that a Whoop or a Garmin or whatever has the same level of features with key functions of the iPhone, because those aren't Apple products.
I'm smiling because you're saying you made the example of Diora, and if the rumors are right that Apple is going to have a ring of their own,
A
we'll
ring.
see.
Yeah.
if
Yes.
if my Aura continues to work in the same, and I think that's where at the end of the day where it is, right? If my Aura continues to work in the same way it has been, but Apple, because of that, verticalization, will deliver a ring that can do more, is one
Right.
thing. But if you know Apple intentionally prevents certain things, um,
Right.
that's where people get, the conversation gets heated, because it's like, well, now this is they can do more because they chose to, and their competition cannot.
Right.
We
Right.
never
Okay.
quite
So
had an example like that, or something that was available before and worked well, and then Apple brings something to market from a hardware perspective.
from a hardware
So it'll be
perspective, yeah.
interesting to see.
Right. Right. Agreed. So last point, with all of these things, the way these antitrust suits work is said person making claims lists a bunch of different things, 4 or 5 kind of ridiculous things, and they're hoping to win just one or two things. Now, I don't know if we know what that is, but my hunch is it's something relative to the App Store. I think that they're really after not necessarily what happened with Epic, but maybe more in line with what the DMA is doing in Europe, where alternate payments, alternate stores, giving developers or services or businesses a way to skirt around Apple's App Store transaction and commission fees. That I feel like is what they're after. I could again be totally wrong, but just thinking like, what's the one win I think they'd want to walk away with? I think it's that. Um, but I don't know if you have a different read on that.
No, I think that what we're seeing in Europe, and even this, I think, the whole conversation around the store gets generalized when it is really not the case, right?
Right.
Like, large developers have different needs than small developers. And I think that um, the large developers that can have their own payments, set up and create a store, absolutely. And I think that is different than not a small developers that depends on Apple for so many different things, right? Because at the end of the day, the store, talking about innovation, the store has allowed the flourishing of all the smaller developers, and we have the app economy because of Apple, and Google follows suit with that. But from a consumer perspective, the same way as I might choose to go and buy from Amazon even if somebody else has a better price, is because I have free shipping, fast shipping, and I have an easy return. So there are things that come with a store, right, that consumers benefit from and that the developers benefit from. When you're a larger developer and you can do a lot of those things on your own, you should be given the option to do that, right? And I
Yeah.
think that that's where we both have argued in the past that Apple could have done more to ease some of the limitations that developer has, and looking at their commission as part of that exercise.
Yep. All right, interesting stuff. This is probably going to be a continued topic on our bit by bit show, but we'll leave it at that. And as more stuff happens continuing this theme, we will be sure to touch on it. So stay tuned until the next episode, and thanks for listening.